Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining. There are still people coming into the Zoom room, so please bear with me, and we're going to start in a minute or so. Right, let's make a start. There might be some people still dropping in, but thanks everyone for joining this BRC training event on prediction methods, focusing specifically on AI. So my name is Niels. I'm Professor of Health Informatics, and I lead the BRC Informatics and Data Science cross-cutting theme. I'm going to start by handing over to Professor Ian Bruce to give you an update on the BRC, what's happening there, and then I'll come back and give you an introduction to today's event. So, Ian, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Niels, and thank you to yourself and Jane and everybody for organising this meeting on artificial intelligence. This is a really exciting area, as you all know. And I think this afternoon's symposium, I think will give a very good, clear overview of where we're up to with this, with some nice examples, etc. So that's really excellent. I think what I was going to do to start with is just give you a very brief overview of where we are as of September 2020 with the BRC, what's been happening over the past few months during lockdown, etc., and then sort of where we're thinking about now, because whilst the next BRC doesn't really officially kick off until 2022, we're beginning to think about where we're going with this already. So next slide. So as you know, the overall vision of our BRC and its mission is driving health improvements and lasting change for all through creative, inclusive, and proactive research that identifies and bridges gaps between new discoveries and individualized care. So very much thinking about taking that early translational step, what's being discovered, what's being sort of thought about as the next new innovations, and then how we take that through and prove its value with regard to individualized patient care, personalized medicine, P4 medicine, etc. Next. Now, the past 6 months, like everybody, a lot of things have been quite stormy. A lot of things have been put to one side because of COVID-19. And the BRC is no different to most of the other research infrastructure across Manchester. So as you know, both the university and the NIHR prioritise COVID-19 work. And because this is a health emergency, a virus that creates major problems with regard to the respiratory system, and then more systemically, several of our themes have been involved quite deeply in the work of COVID-19. And I think particularly two big areas, the respiratory theme and the cross-cutting theme of data sciences that you'll hear about later as well. But a lot of the themes have been really heavily involved in the work of prioritising COVID-19. And as a result of that, that means that some of the other themes, if you were to do a red, amber, green status, a lot of the other work is at amber because it's had to be set to one side for a period of time until we deal with this crisis. You'll also know that NIHR have now put together a restart programme for trying to get all the other research underway, because there's lots of other major health priorities that need to be dealt with, and we don't want the research to slow down. But of course, we now have a sort of fixed budget within the NIHR, be it the BRC, be it the CRM, etc. Restart activities are underway, but we still have ongoing COVID commitments. You'll see that there's still some hospitalizations, and those are probably going to rise over the next few months, sadly. So that means getting more people into COVID trials, getting more people into COVID long-term studies, etc. And there are a number of those underway. And of course, there's a very large program of vaccine trials that are just about to take off in Greater Manchester as well. So whilst Restart is underway for the BRC as well, there's an awful lot of other commitments in COVID that we need to continue to keep a good, strong eye on and deliver on. The other thing that we've been told by the Department of Health and Social Care is that whilst the starting gun for the next BRC competition should have started around about December, perhaps January, over the turn of the year this year, there's at least a 5-month delay on that. And the 5-month delay is because of COVID, of course, and assuming no further delays, then it's likely that competition will kick off a few months later, probably March or April, with a costed extension being provided for the bridging. So instead of the next BRC starting in April 2022, it may be around about September that we finally get the go ahead. Of course, one of the big unknowns in this is the 2021 competition and what that's going to look like. Obviously, the economy has taken a huge battering as a result of COVID-19. There's a comprehensive spending review underway. If it was my choice, I would say that the NIHR has played an absolute blinder during the COVID crisis, delivering the recovery trial, delivering some really large platform studies, and they should have an uplift in their funding for the next time. I also think there should be a huge redistribution of the funding away from the southeast and more towards the north of England, because if you look at the number of people who have been recruited to COVID studies and trials over the last 6 months in particular, you'll see that a disproportionate number have been recruited in the north of England, and certainly Greater Manchester has done really, really well in that. So I think if there was a levelling up agenda, I would be moving more money north. I would also be putting more money into the NIHR, but sadly I'm not the Chancellor, and we'll just have to see what Mr. Sunak decides to do. Next slide. So the overall vision and strategy for the 2022 to 27 era, we're beginning to think about this. The vision that we put together earlier, driving research for all, we're going to continue with that vision along our lines all the way through to 2027. I think P4 medicine is evolving now into a more nuanced description of personalised health and care to meet population needs. And that certainly chimes with what you're going to hear a lot about today, where AI fits in, where data sciences fit in, but also it fits with our civic and our GM devolved infrastructures needs and wants, and certainly it's right at the cutting edge of science. So I think we'll continue with that. We draw in more from our basic science and other faculties' expertise. And one of the things we learned through the COVID crisis is really, I think, how to work really, really well as a university across all 3 faculties, pulling in mathematics, pulling in computer sciences, pulling in basic science from engineering, from the humanities, etc., pulling in some of their major insights into behavior, etc. So I think what we'll see in the next BRC is a lot more pulling in the work from our other faculties and the basic science strengths within our own faculties as well. And then I think we will have a very clear route to validation and deployment. I suspect we'll be asked that from the NIHR as well, very much like the mask redesignation recently, where there were a lot of questions about how you accelerate delivery, how you pull things through to development and deployment and out into the wider population. And I think with the Diagnostics Accelerator, the Applied Research Centre, and with Health Innovation Manchester, we've got real roots out into our community now, much, much better than we had perhaps 5 years ago. Next slide. So one of the things, the other thing I think we'll be thinking about for the next BRC is really how we, if you like, beef up the core of the BRC. So we have a lot more flexibility to work across themes and work across new things. And Niels was pointing out, and he's absolutely right, even 4 or 5 years ago when we were writing the last BRC, the whole world of artificial intelligence was very, very much at its sort of infancy. It's now become a much bigger thing. And so we now have to think about, in the next 5 years, the things that we don't really know are going to be big. How do we be flexible with over the next 5-year funding cycle to make sure that we can be flexible to sort of meet the new demands and the new things that are happening? There's a lot of NIHR activity going along already in Manchester around the research facility, the translational research collaborations, the health informatics collaborative, and that spreads beyond our usual traditional BRC themes out into cardiovascular, viral hepatitis, etc. We've got the bioresource that we're building as a major national resource for patients going forward. I think that across Greater Manchester, and particularly within the University of Manchester, there are already a lot of other initiatives for translational research that are maturing. There's the DITA, the Diagnostics Technology Accelerator. There's the Translational Partnership Awards from the Wellcome Trust, Translation at Manchester, the Pankhurst Centre, etc., all aiming to pull basic work out of the university into early phase work and on out into healthcare developments. I've highlighted digital and data science as the focus of this afternoon's symposium. And again, thinking about how we have a team of experts within the BRC that will help all the themes and serve all the themes and sort of pull all these insights through, and also be flexible to work with new areas as we go forward. And I think in particular, one of the things about our cross-cutting themes currently is that we haven't really exploited the opportunity to support new development of methodology, core skills, etc. I think we need to do that more in the next BRC. Next slide. So basically, if you think about the faculty grant challenges in Manchester, Graham Lord has put these 3 major challenges to us, thinking about basic disease mechanisms, thinking about prevention and early detection, thinking about advanced therapeutics. And I think when you think about analytics and artificial intelligence, etc., they will really help with our insights into a number of these things. And then I think the next BRC will really try and take those and pull those through from the faculty strengths out into driving health improvements and lasting change for all. So I think that what you'll see over the next few weeks is we want to try and have a broad constituency across Manchester, people who are interested in translational work, to basically, if you like, give us some insights into how you see the current BRC working and where you think we should be taking the next BRC. And there'll be a sort of a questionnaire survey going out about that. Then very soon as well, we're going to start another, like a mock exam, if you like, for people who want to think about developing new themes for the next BRC to come together, to put together proposals of things that are big and strong, with strength and depth within Manchester, so we begin to think what the size, the scope, and the vision of the next BRC is, linked to what we've been doing before. So those things will be happening over the next few weeks, and we'll be announcing those as we go along, but certainly everybody's input into that would be greatly appreciated. So that's all I'm going to say. So thank you very much. I think this is going to be a really interesting afternoon, and thank you to all the speakers and the organisers again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. That was very, very helpful to see that update and the plans that we have going forward for the next BRC. So we've got a lot of people in the meeting today, more than 150. Could I ask everyone to stay muted and keep their video switched off? And if you have a question, and that includes if you have a question for Ian, please enter that question into the chat so we can respond to it. There is one question already, which I think is for Jane. Will a recording of this session be available? Jane, is that going to happen?
Niels, it is recording already. I can see it in the top left.
I can see that. No, it is recording, but the question is whether that recording will be made available. Let me get back to that. Oh, yes, there is the session is recorded and will be posted on the BRC website. Thanks, Jane. So, Matt, I hope that answers your question. And another question is from Anil. Will we have a CPD/CME certificate for this event? Again, that's one either for you or Jane or for George. The answer is yes. Okay, that was very quick. Thanks, Jane. So thanks again, Ian. I assume you will be online for a while in this meeting still?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I'll just mute myself and everything, thanks.
Great. So if you have any question for Ian, feel free to post that in the chat. With that, let me give you my introduction to today's event. So it's great to see so many people joining today, more than 150, and that was also what we kind of expected. In last year's prediction training event, we already spoke about AI, and many people asked questions then. So we then decided this would be the right topic to cover in this year's event. So let me just give you brief background about what we do in the BRC in terms of informatics and data sciences before I talk you through today's agenda. So there are broadly speaking 4 areas that we cover in informatics and data science. So the first is clinical research informatics. By that we mean making routinely collected data from primary and secondary care available for researchers. And particularly in secondary care and acute care, that is still quite a challenge. We're involved in a national initiative called the Health Informatics Collaborative, which has been set up through the network of BRCs. And each of the HICs, the Health Informatics Collaboratives, work on a specific disease area. So there's one, for instance, in hearing health that we have set up. So Kevin Monroe, who's involved, is on the call today. But there are also HICs in cardiovascular disease. There is one in COVID now obviously. There are HICs in renal disease and a number of other disease areas. But the second activity in informatics and data science in the cross-cutting theme in our BSc is data science for P4 medicine. And that really relates to today's training event. So prediction obviously is at the heart, I would say, of that area of work, the data science for P4 medicine. The third area of work is digital transformation of clinical pathways. So once we have, say, a prediction model, the question then is always, how are we now going to use that in clinical pathways? How are we going to transform those pathways using such a model? So that's a separate area of work where we also work very closely with other NIHR infrastructure, like, for instance, the Applied Research Collaboration, the ARC. And the fourth area of work is training and capacity building, which is extremely important in informatics and data science because the demand is huge. There are many, many people in the BRC and as well as outside the BRC who have the need to use advanced data science methods. Our team is not big enough to help everyone doing that. So the way we are really trying to achieve that is increase capacity in this area and train BRC researchers in data science and AI. And Georgina Moulton is going to say more about that after my talk. So let me move on. So the theme is closely linked to the digital health domain in FBMH and the digital health and care theme in digital futures. And those two things are actually almost the same thing. So digital futures, as you may know, is a university-wide initiative focusing on digital technologies that are being researched within the university, within any of the 3 faculties. Health and care is one of the bigger themes in digital futures. And what you see here on the slide is basically how we have defined what the domain, the theme, is about. And we've made a distinction between algorithms, systems, and people. And today's event is obviously very much focusing on the algorithm side of things. Prediction methods is one of the key strengths, I would say, in digital health and care in Manchester. So you see it also here on the slide, and that is what today's event is all about, and specifically about AI. The health and care theme is also closely linked to work that we're doing together with the Alan Turing Institute, the National Institute for Data Science and AI. We've got quite an extensive program in health funded by the Turing. In fact, it's the largest activity in health in the Turing across the country. And on the slide here, you see the projects that are ongoing and the people that are involved. And if you'd like to know more about that, then feel free to reach out to me. So at last year's event, which was also very well attended, although not as many people as today, it was decided to set up a risk prediction network across the BRC, and that's led by Dr. Nikki Flaum and Dr. Glenn Martin. So that network has met over the last 12 months a number of times in face-to-face meetings, I think probably more recently also in virtual meetings. If you'd like to know more about the network's activities or would like to get involved, then please reach out to either Nikki or Glenn. Feel free to reach out to me and I'll connect you to them. So today's program looks as follows. We've heard Ian and myself. Then Professor George Moulton is going to give an update in the next 10 minutes on BRC training and specifically focusing on informatics and data science. And then we're going to have a talk from Professor Chris Yau. So Chris joined us in January of this year. He's Professor of AI in the School of Health Sciences. And his talk is going to give an overview of the different methods in AI that exist to create prediction models and how they differ from the ones that most of you will know, the ones that come from statistical modeling, so regression analysis. We will then have a short break, 10 minutes, and after the break, we're going to have two slightly more applied talks. So the first is from Dr. Lamise Hassan, focusing on natural language processing to investigate questions using social media data. In this case, Lamise is looking at social media commentaries about e-cigarettes following a lung injury outbreak. And finally, we have Dr. Martin Fergie speaking about artificial intelligence and medical image analysis. As I mentioned before, if you have any questions, please enter them into the chat and speakers will pick them up directly after their talk. And unless there are any questions for me, I am going to hand over immediately to George. George, the floor is yours.
Niels, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thanks, Niels. Good afternoon, and thanks, Niels. I'm Georgina Moulton. I'm the BRC training lead. I'm also a professor in biohealth informatics and education here at Manchester. And today what I'm going to do is give you a brief update on the training capacity building across the BRC. I'd also like to draw attention to Jane Crosby. She's been doing a lot of work during the last 6 months, keeping the community together for the BRC, and I know that it's been a difficult time to do this, so thank you, Jane. So hopefully this will work. So I've just given us a brief update on who we are and what we do. In addition to Jane and myself, there are also training leads from each theme. So please do approach your training leads from each theme. If you don't know who they are, then please do contact me or Jane. We'll be able to let you know. But they are responsible for specific training in your theme, which Jane and I meet with them on a basis to understand what those needs are. But just to highlight here that the BRC does sit in a wider training landscape at Manchester, and very much how Ian was saying how the BRC sits within a wider research network, we do sit in this much wider training network. The NIHR infrastructure and NIHR Academy are those national bodies and national pieces, training pieces that look at different elements from a national perspective. I will talk about some of the opportunities that they will bring later on. Whereas those like HIM and the Faculty Doctoral Academy, etc., are those that Manchester have to offer, and there are lots of training opportunities that we do signpost you to every month that are provided by those other organisations and academies. What we're trying to do at the BRC is make sure that we can address the needs, the skills needs and development needs of those across the BRC, but also how can we then make sure that that is sustainable in the longer term and make it attractive to those people beyond the BRC. So the first port of call, and was at the start of a new academic year, that we have an MRes in experimental medicine. It's really good that the experimental medicine MRes is aligned to the pathways of the BRC, and now we have all pathways represented in the experimental medicine. There are 4 key modules that people study, ranging from research methods to assembling a preclinical and early clinical strategies for a new candidate drug. What I'd really like to point out here is that the introduction to experimental medicine, if you should feel that you like to take this as CPD, there's an opportunity to do so. So that module is very good at being able to put into context where different groups sit in experimental medicine and giving you the key overview. Also provided through that experimental medicine, and particularly for supervisors, are research projects, and they run for the full length of the programme. Now, I've provided a very quick overview, but should you require any further information about the MRes in experimental medicine, how you can become involved as a sort of a research project supervisor, or you wish to study on it, please do contact Natalie Cook, who's the programme director. She's based down at the Christie, and her contact details are there. In terms of PhDs and fellows, it really has been quite disruptive the last 6 months for studies. And Jane and a group of us have been using drop-in sessions rather to discuss the challenges around this. I'd really like to see those continue, and hopefully we can provide some help if it's not just how do you go around getting an interruption or extending your studies, but other challenges that we may be able to help with. So we are there and we will listen. And I think it's very important that those still go ahead. So if there are any difficulties, please do contact me and Jane. Now, research placements have been something that we've run at the BRC since the start, and we are just in the midst of pulling together some projects for the research placements across the BRC themes, and a call will be going out soon. But this really is to attract those people based in the NHS into an introduction into research and on what that might look like. And these are 6-week placements, so it's a real opportunity to come and have a taste of research in a particular BRC theme. And we've attracted a number of different roles into these research placements, as you can see on the slide. We're also experimenting with and looking at 12-week placements and what they may look like over the longer term. This is very much about building a career and a sustainable career for people in research. So please do keep an eye out for the calls around research placements. And here's Jake, who's a clinical pharmacist. He did a respiratory placement, and again was being able to be introduced to the groundwork for systematic review. So it's a great opportunity to develop your skills. So training and capacity building has been slightly disrupted over the 6 months, but I think it's now time, hopefully, to reinvigorate it and looking at our priorities moving forward. So there are the placements. These are looking at those collaborations across the NIHR landscape. We've successfully worked with the ARC to do this. So please do keep out an eye out for the placements. We'd like to continue the training series and the collaboration and alignment. One thing that we did start last year was the Northern BRC collaboration in terms of training, and this has gone ahead in terms of specific themes, but again I think there's some appetite to do a more generic BRC collaboration training event, so please do keep an eye out again. Those highlighted in bold are where I'd really like to focus. Short courses and workshops are of particular importance and can address skills needs quite quickly. Niels did highlight that after the clinical prediction training last year, there was a demand for training in this area. So we're putting together, again with Glenn, who leads the clinic that Niels mentioned, a clinical risk prediction modelling programme, and we're going to look at what that might look like in an online series of work. And we're going to build off the mini training camp on fellowship and grant applications that we did last year, which is how do you simulate research development or proposal exercise. And I'd look to do that online so that we can all have an opportunity of being able to develop new research ideas around the BRC themes. The final thing is, how do you perform translational science and where's your role within it? One of the things that we've identified is the difference between holding a clinical problem and then being able to translate that into a workable protocol. And perhaps that may be in data science and informatics, which is a field that I focus on. But that's something that I'd like to see whether we can address within the BRC. And finally, I'd like to highlight the industry development training. We would like to put together a programme to address innovation skills. We've been working across the BRC with our industry leads, what that might look like, and we'd embed industry then both into the research but also into the training, and giving people an idea of how to address their innovation skills. So those are our priorities moving forward, and those that I've just highlighted, those that are coming up pretty soon. My final slide is to just highlight the NIHR further opportunities. So the BRC sits in a much wider landscape, and there are two things that I'd like to draw your attention to. One are the Spark placements. This is an opportunity that if you are funded by the NIHR infrastructure, that you can go and experience an internship almost at another NIHR site. So for example, another BRC or another ARC. And the call for that will be coming out at the end of September, early October. So if you think you might like to develop some skills or may go and work in another place, please do apply for that. It's currently not well, people don't often apply for this, so you've got a high chance of being successful. And also what I'd like to highlight for those members of the BRC is it's a really good opportunity for us to be able to host others too. So should people approach us, then I think this is something that we should be able to adapt to. And finally, it's the incubators. NIHR has this infrastructure called an incubator, which is looking at sustainable careers and opportunities in core areas or specific areas of need. And there are many of them. I've highlighted 4 here, particularly the methodology and the data science. I chair the data science incubator, but also am involved in the methodology incubator. And there will be opportunities, training opportunities provided by those incubators in the next 6 months. And again, we will advertise those. But should you not be interested in those 2 areas, there are ones in nursing, mental health, and other clinical education, and many others. So we will make those opportunities available through the BRC in the monthly newsletter. And finally, I'd just like to say, please do keep an eye out for training opportunities. They are more likely to be online, but they will be available and hopefully going to address your skills needs. Thanks very much, Niels.
Great, thanks very much, George. That was extremely helpful. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I think would be useful to address before we move on. So the first one was actually from Gladder, Kevin. What is the latest from NIHR regarding extension of PhD funding for projects that have been delayed because of COVID-19? Is that something that you know?
Hopefully I'm still not on mute, but Kevin, we're still working through this. Unfortunately, I think all funding bodies at the moment seem to have ground to a halt around this, but I am trying to push to find out what that is. So should I find out, or should Jane find out, we will definitely let you know, because I do know this is a matter of urgency for many people across the BRC. I can see the next question, Niels, about the Spark placements, whether we know they're face-to-face or remote this year. I'm going to say, we're just getting news through from those Spark placements. It hasn't been clear whether they're likely to be face-to-face or remote. So again, I can't really give you a definitive answer, but that information will be coming through in September, October. And the final, are the placements available for MRes students only? No, the research placements actually that we advertise are available for people in the NHS and not just for those on the MRes. So the research placements are for everybody who would like to give research a taste, and not just available for MRes.
Great, thanks, George. Perhaps as a final comment, I'd like to re-emphasize, George already mentioned it, that we're very aware that AI is an area where there's a huge demand. There's many people who would like to know more or like to start applying AI and advanced data science methods. So we are working on that. Please be aware that we are a relatively small group, and we've got, for instance, more than 150 people on this call. So it's not always feasible to liaise with people directly, but we're trying to do everything we can to help people. So we're thinking of setting up clinics where people who are writing a grant can liaise with one of our team. And we're going to organize training, as George already mentioned. And there's also the clinical prediction network that I mentioned earlier. I failed to mention, by the way, that network is co-led by Jamie Sargent as well. So Glenn Martin, Nikki Flaum, and Jamie Sargent. With that, I'm going to hand over to Chris Yau. And we're finally going to really talk about AI now. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Niels. Can people see my screen? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm Chris Yau. I'm Professor of AI in Manchester. I joined in January, but obviously because of lockdown, some of you may not have seen me around much recently. So what I'm going to be talking about over the next 20 minutes or so is really to give you a high-level overview of the development of risk prediction algorithms and how AI approaches for doing that differ from perhaps the sort of more classical regression-based techniques. So first of all, what is risk prediction for those in the audience who aren't familiar with this area? And broadly speaking, risk prediction aims to come up with methods that allow us to compute the probability of future events or outcomes given information about current risk factors. So you might be interested in survival given a particular individual's current health profile or other events of interest, depending on your application. And in this talk, what I'll try to give you a run through is how AI differs from other analytical methods for developing these prediction models, how AI works compared to these other traditional methods, and when to consider using AI and what to do if you want to use AI. So first, what is a prediction model in a bit more detail? So here's a little schematic that I've drawn here. And here, a prediction algorithm is something that takes in a series of risk factors, and what those risk factors are will depend on your particular problem of interest. And it churns through those risk factors and spits out either a single or potentially multiple predictions of how likely certain outcomes are going to arise for that individual potentially in the future. And the algorithm essentially represents a type of mathematical transformation that turns those inputs or those predictors into the desired output. And the design of a prediction algorithm is essentially about learning what that mathematical operation is, or designing that mathematical operation. So one type of commonly used sort of prediction model is based on something known as logistic regression. And in this type of approach, the idea is to predefine a relationship between those, a mathematical relationship between the predictors and the outcomes using a so-called parametric model. And in logistic regression, we might, where we have binary outcomes, we might take, for example, two input risk factors. I've called them X1 and X2 here. We multiply these by some unknown parameters. I've called them theta 1 and theta 2 here. We push them through a mathematical transformation known as a logistic function. And this gives us out a probability that one of those events that we're interested occurring. And the key here is that the logistic transformation when we design this prediction model is pre-specified and fixed. The way the inputs and predictors interact with the parameters is known, and the only unknowns are the parameter values themselves. And this is what we're going to be learning or tuning when we take a data set and kind of fit the model to that data. So there are a number of standard models that are used for prediction. These include linear regression if you have continuous outcomes, logistic regression, as I've already outlined, if you have binary outcomes, and there's also Cox regression if you have time to event or censored outcomes. So if you're interested in survival, you might use Cox regression. And the principle underlying these kind of parametric modeling approaches is that the data can be explained using a relatively simple law that we impose upon the problem. So parametric risk prediction models can give very useful outputs, and there are many examples out there, including things like Q-risk and the Framingham risk score of these risk prediction models working very well and giving real world benefits. However, in the quest to build sort of better prediction models, many people are now striving to squeeze more performance out of the data sets that we have using alternative methods. And it's worth stepping back and thinking about where this extra gain in performance might come from. So in theory, what we would like is a prediction algorithm that becomes optimal given an infinite amount of data to learn from. And optimal here does not mean perfect prediction. Perfect prediction occurs when the problem is essentially deterministic, and which is normally not really the regime that we're interested in, because this would imply there's no stochasticity or randomness in the problem. What we mean by optimality here is that there's no other prediction algorithm given that infinite set of data that we could learn from that could do better than this algorithm that we then come up with. And any deviation from perfect performance is due entirely to intrinsic uncertainty related to the problem. So this might be due to measurement error that's inherent, or variability in treatment response due to individual factors. With a parametric model, we assume a particular relationship between the predictors and the outcomes. And it's very unlikely that when we make that assumption of this relationship, that this is a perfectly accurate description of how the real world works. Therefore, no matter how much data we possess, we will always reach a ceiling on performance due to what is known as misspecification. Because so if our parametric model is not a completely accurate description of the real world, we will always have a performance deficit because we're not making assumptions which are completely accurate. So the question is, how can we remove some of these parametric constraints that we might traditionally apply to a problem and adopt a more model agnostic approach to learning? Another limitation of existing techniques is that there's an increasing interest in feeding in the more diverse and heterogeneous set of data types into prediction models. So these might be images, it might be whole sort of electronic health records, speech signals, or other types of biological signals. And the following two talks after mine are great examples of this. The common theme across all these types of data sets is that they're typically complex. They involve high dimensional signals, which are being measured. And these high dimensional measurements are not easily described using a few summary statistics, which is really the regime where sort of more classical regression-based techniques operate. So in order to use these type of data types, we not only need an algorithm that handles the prediction side of things, we also need machinery to be able to accurately process these types of data sets. And these might include incorporations of dimensionality reduction to deal with those high dimensional aspects of the data, or pattern mining and feature recognition to extract the signals that are relevant to the prediction exercise. So answering these kind of questions is really one of the main drivers of recent interest in artificial intelligence. AI covers a wide range of activities and technologies, but for risk prediction, the branch of AI that we're typically concerned with is machine learning, and I shall outline what this means shortly. First, it should be noted that machine learning has considerable overlap with the field known as non-parametric statistics, which also has the same goal of modeling data with fewer modeling assumptions and relationships. And in my personal opinion, the differences are kind of cosmetic. Statistical side tends to deal more with the underlying mathematical rigor and theoretical properties, whilst the machine learning field has tended to focus more on the computational aspects. But this is a very kind of loose, broad, and very imprecise definition. What's really happening is that everyone is working along a spectrum of different types of models, where you have more classical methods on one end and more model agnostic approaches on the other end. And this kind of spectrum of potential models crosses the traditional disciplinary boundaries. So what is machine learning? Well, in its purest kind of form, it refers to a general class of algorithms or models that are driven by data. And these models can be continually updated given new knowledge or data. And in theory, given enough data or an infinite amount of data to learn from, it will reach some kind of optimal performance. And remember, optimality here is that I can take another machine learning algorithm, give it an infinite amount of data, and that alternative algorithm won't be able to beat my optimal one once optimality has been reached. How do we do this? Well, machine learning algorithms typically do this by making fewer assumptions about the relationships between my inputs and the outcomes than in regular parametric modeling. And in fact, ideally, the relationship between the predictors and the outcomes should be entirely learnt from the training data that we put in. So if we have a training data set which consists of a large number of input and output pairings, the goal of machine learning is to try directly learn that mathematical operation that maps those inputs to the relevant prediction outputs. And so this is subtly different to parametric modeling, where one is actually interested more in optimizing the parameters of the model to maximize the consistency of my assumed model with the data. And what this means in practice is that whilst with sort of classical parametric modeling, you can encode fairly nice, smooth mathematical relationships between predictors and outcomes, with machine learning, I can learn much more complex relationships between those predictors and the outcomes. And this may be both beneficial, but also potentially a little bit dangerous, as I'll outline later. There are many types of machine learning models that are used for prediction, and these include things like random forests, support vector machines, or Gaussian processes. Many of these have been around for many years and are regularly used even now. But perhaps what has excited the imagination of people in recent years has been the use of neural networks and the use of neural networks within the emerging field of deep learning. And there have been numerous high-profile examples of using deep learning for prediction within the literature recently, including sort of well-publicized works by Google Health / DeepMind in ophthalmology and breast screening. But there have been also many others as well. So what is deep learning? Deep learning essentially uses these networks of so-called neurons, which are essentially a type of machinery which takes as input your predictors, essentially pushes them through a very large series of mathematical transformations. So we're not just pushing it just through one mathematical transformation, we're stacking all these mathematical transformations together in these layers. And each of these transformations has their own parameters, which I will need to tune according to some training data set so that I can match predictors with their respective outcomes. This gives these networks what is known as high expressiveness, so they can represent very, very complex relationships, far more complex than can be offered by a kind of classical parametric modeling, which uses fairly simple transformations. So these networks actually a type of parametric network themselves, but there are just so many parameters that the interpreter or effect of each one of those parameters is somehow lost because you have so many degrees of freedom. Whereas in a logistic regression model, well, each one of my parameters can be associated with a predictor, and I can interpret that parameter in terms of the associated predictor. In a deep learning model, I have so many parameters that it is very difficult for me to understand what each one of those parameters is doing in terms of transforming those predictors into the outcome. Non-parametric statistics also has a similar kind of idea, and actually the term non-parametric, despite what it's, the wording, it actually means that there's lots of parameters or an infinite number of parameters. So given the data sets, these deep neural networks can be optimized to give strong prediction performance by using a training and a set of training and test data sets. And these optimizations are done using very standard numerical routines, which have been implemented on a number of popular now frameworks, programming frameworks for designing deep neural nets. And this approach has been quite revolutionary for dealing with complex high-dimensional data sets like images and text. And the reason why is that for these kind of data types, information exists often within multiple layers of abstraction, and the data hides compositional information. So for example, in an image, the information content would be stored as a series of pixel values. But its higher level information content about what the picture actually contains is somehow embedded within that numerical array. And what deep learning has been shown to do is be able to extract out those kind of notions, those semantic notions from that numerical context. So for example, if I feed in a series of facial images into a deep neural net, what I might find is that one layer of that deep neural net is extracting out high-level facial shapes. Another might be extracting out facial features like eyes or noses. Another might be extracting out raw image features like edges and corners. So by breaking down these data sets into these different levels of abstractions, I'm able to potentially link this up with a prediction network and to build an overall prediction system which harnesses the relevant image features that are pertinent to my particular problem of interest. So deep neural nets have the benefits of being highly flexible and allowing very complex relationships between potentially high-dimensional predictors and their outcomes. However, this comes with some cost because the increased flexibility needs to be managed in order to avoid overfitting. And overfitting refers to the fact when a prediction model is overly tuned to the specifics of one data set, that its performance fails to generalize to other data sets. And in fact, what you are doing is that you're exceeding the actual true optimal performance limits by actually modeling noise or intrinsic stochasticity in your data rather than the general real world mechanism which is producing that data. So overfitting a deep learning model might allow you to seemingly exceed the actual optimal performance of a true optimal predictor. But this will be completely artificial and only peculiar to the data set which you've kind of trained the machine on. Deep learning also suffers from potential other issues due to its increased flexibility. You might find unintended associations between your predictors and your outcomes, things that you haven't thought about before. There are well publicized examples of this, particularly in imaging, where, for example, perhaps you might have a label just been left on your images, which is only left inserted the image if a patient falls into a particular class of outcomes, and your deep learning algorithm has tweaked that and has trained itself to detect whether that label on that image is present or not. There are other issues such as data memorization. These networks, you can build a network which is so complex and has so much capacity then instead of learning a prediction model, it simply memorizes the training data that has been inserted into it, and essentially does a type of matching when it does a prediction instead of coming up with a general prediction law. So essentially, like a very state-of-the-art piece of machinery with many moving parts, can have many ways of breaking down. A complex deep learning algorithm also suffers from the same issue, and much of the art of sort of designing with deep learning is associated with trying to manage that kind of complexity and to, in technical terminology, to regularize the behavior of the model. So whether one might choose to use deep learning or more classical regression techniques for prediction models depends on a number of factors, and I've shown a few of these here, but not exhaustively. So one of the things you might want to think about is how much flexibility and expressiveness you might require from your prediction model, and noting that this might impinge on levels of interpretability. Is it more important for your model to get the predictions completely right, or do you want to make sure that you're not overconfident or potentially making incorrect predictions? What type of data set types are you using? Classical prediction models tend to work better with relatively low dimensional, what I would call tabular data, whilst deep learning comes into its own for very high dimensional data types like images and text. And further, the last thing is also to think about the amount of expertise that you have available to you. With learning, you have the expertise to robustly fine-tune a more complex model and to make sure that it doesn't suffer from some of the issues that I've identified on the previous slides. One thing that's kind of important is that regardless of whether you've developed a prediction model based on either classical statistical approaches or machine learning, is that some of the normal rules apply in both instances. So for example, we shouldn't use a prediction model to answer causal questions. And this means that we can't answer interventional or what's if type questions by simply tweaking the predictors of our prediction model and examining the changes in the prediction output. Prediction models model the probability of the outcomes given a set of input risk factors. They don't really model what happens to the outcomes if I were to intervene or change the inputs in a particular way. And there's often a lot of confusion about this because there's a sort of not well specified, well actually it is well specified, but people don't think about this more carefully enough. There's a distinction between etiological and predictive questioning. So prediction models are typically built on real world observational data in which we have limited or no control over how that data is acquired. Whereas in etiological research, one can control the factors experimentally and examine one thing at a time, often allowing causation to be established in a way that prediction models cannot be done using real world observational data. And there have been a number of sort of recent controversies due to certain studies in the field involving machine learning, seeming appearing to overcome these limitations by learning from data. But these are incorrect. They do not apply the correct principles of causal inference. But this type of misinterpretation of prediction algorithms has been around for a long time and plays not only the more recent machine learning variants, but people have misinterpreted prediction algorithms that have been built using classical statistical models in the past as well. If you wish to actually answer causal questions, you need specifically designed causal prediction algorithms, which can be developed. And I don't have the time to talk about this more specifically right now. It's a long discussion on its own. But what I can do is point you towards a recent workshop that was organized by Matt Sperrin in Health Informatics, which is hosted by the Alan Turing Institute, and there's a link at the bottom, which will give you further insights into that. So there's a series of videos covering the talks as part of that workshop recorded online. Broadly speaking, the idea of using causal inference means that we need to incorporate a priori knowledge or learning of the dependencies between the predictors. And only with this kind of extended model where we incorporate these kind of dependencies, which are often sort of graphically represented by one of these directed acyclic graphs, or DAGs, shown at the top right-hand corner here, can we then begin to actually answer causation questions within a prediction framework. And this type of thinking is now becoming increasingly important with the increased interest in deploying machine learning-based prediction algorithms in healthcare, where here it's kind of fundamental to understand the relationship between the mechanisms for how data are acquired, the patient populations from which that data are acquired, and how those patient populations are selected, and what those characteristics of those data sets are, and how decisions might lead to certain downstream patient classifications. And this is important because this is concerned with making sure that these algorithms are generalizable across different populations, and to overcome certain potential bias artifacts to ensure that the algorithms are actually effective in all the settings that you might claim them to be. What's exciting from me from a personal perspective about deep learning is not the fact that we can directly construct potentially a single monolithic neural network prediction algorithm, but rather that because there's been an entire industry now that has been built around deep learning, and the wider community are benefiting from the huge range of computational frameworks and infrastructure that's been created around it. So increasingly, we see sort of these deep learning programming frameworks such as Google's TensorFlow or PyTorch, which are providing sort of computational components or building blocks that greatly simplify the task of building very complex machine learning models. So for example, here I've taken a figure from a paper that's been recently released on arXiv, which describe how they constructed a very complex deep learning approach to processing electronic health records and predicting a series of potential treatment outcomes. The goal here is to identify opportunities for drug repurposing. Now, what we see here is that these different boxes correspond to essentially modules. Each module corresponds to a different type of neural network, and each of these neural networks is processing a different aspect of that model. And these programming frameworks that have been developed make putting together these building blocks much easier than perhaps building them from the ground up, which we might have had to do if we were following a more classical approach using sort of classical tools. And what we need to be aware of is that building prediction algorithms has traditionally been a bit of a cottage industry, with researchers developing bespoke models using their own code bases and engineered really to only work within their own environment. And so the benefits of the ecosystem that has evolved around deep learning is that we have these kind of more generic programming frameworks, these modules and these building blocks that we can use to put together and to increasingly to automate many of the steps that are required to kind of fit these models and to maximize our local computational hardware. And this is all predicated on the fact that many of these frameworks have been designed for scalable production level systems from the start, not simply for bespoke projects. So really just to end, where can we go with this, and how do we go about building our own prediction models if we have a problem where this type of work is relevant? Well, off the back of what I've just said, many of the major technology companies now see providing tools to help people to build advanced analytics as a serious business opportunity. So automatic machining, or automatic ML, describes sort of a broad range of product development tools, which are there to support individuals with perhaps limited development or programming experience to create custom machine learning models via these cloud-based, often cloud-based AutoML platforms. And these platforms can be used to construct both rudimentary to fairly complex prediction models. As with any tool though, you need to know how to use it, and you should be prepared to engage with experts if you're a novice to make sure that what you're doing is correct. But what is being added and what's the auto in AutoML kind of stands for is that actually a lot of research and implementations behind the scenes with these AutoML platforms that are using AI itself to support the users to build these models and to simplify the construction of complex techniques. Some see these technologies as potentially dangerous, that it makes it easy to generate potentially flawed solutions. And of course, there is a serious danger of this, and absolutely there will be many examples of bad practice that are enabled by these platforms. However, as someone who has personally spent an awful lot of time over the years repeatedly building similar types of models from scratch, I kind of welcome these innovations because I believe in the long term, they will be beneficial, providing us with a next generation of computational building blocks. And these will sort of free us from thinking from sort of the technicalities of the implementation to thinking more about the design of the models, more about the questions that we want to answer and how to overcome statistical barriers, concerns about bias and confounding, rather than worrying about detailed implementation issues that these platforms are designed to overcome. So that's the end of my talk. Thanks for listening to this brief overview of AI prediction models.
Many thanks, Chris. That was really good, I thought, and really good overview of the field and very helpful for everyone, I think. There's been a couple of questions in the chat. So Anozi asked for the details of the causal AI prediction workshop. I've posted the link, the web link already in the chat, and also the link to Cloud AutoML. There is one question that I just see popping up from Raleigh. What's your advice, Ray? Blue Prism?
I can't recall exactly what Blue Prism is at the moment.
I can't either, so I was hoping that you would. Raleigh,
I remember the name, but I can't recognize exactly what it is. The context is there.
So Raleigh, we're going to need a little bit of your help with reminding us what that is. And are there any other questions for Chris? Please post them in the chat. Chris, I think that many people are still digesting what you just told them. One of the other questions that came up earlier is whether the slides would be made available, and we will do that. So they will be on the website of the BRC. Jane has already posted the link to the URL for that. So there are a couple of new questions. So Raleigh is saying they're working with the NHS, Blue Prism.
That unfortunately doesn't help me to determine what that is. I think Raleigh has also messaged me privately with some questions, so I can answer that offline, perhaps.
Okay. Maybe before we break, Chris, so how do you see that, this field is going to evolve then, listening to what you were saying? And I agree that, machine learning gives us opportunity to move away from the cottage industry that data science still very much is. So on this call, for instance, we have a lot of people who are working on a model based on the data set from that project. How do you expect that will look in 5 or 10 years' time? Is that going to go away? Is all of that going to happen by just pressing a button? Or will researchers like the people on this call still have a role, but perhaps fundamentally different?
I think with this type of development, things naturally evolve. When I was a PhD student, about 15 years ago, I would write my bespoke code to do almost everything. from the ground up. But then eventually I evolved to using pre-built libraries for various aspects of the models that I'm constructing. And I think, as I said, this is like the next generation of building block. It's not just a library of commonly used algorithmic routines. It's actually potentially entire modules that do a particular task that we're then stitching together. And of course, as in other industries, this is how we, generation from generation, build increasingly complex kind of machinery. So I think what the spirit of what we will be doing is going to remain the same over the next 10 years. The tools with which we do it are going to evolve and improve to free us from the detailed nitty gritty. 20 years ago, all you'd be thinking about is how to manage memory and CPU cycles with your code. Now, Google or Microsoft will take away that burden from you to leave you, hopefully, to think about the important things like addressing bias or confounders in your particular problem. Of course, the other danger is that you end up with all these building blocks and you construct something which is very untidy and leads to misinterpretation of your particular problem.
Yeah. Thanks. I see that there's another question in the chat, but I think we need to break now. So maybe, Chris, you could try to answer those questions via the chat whilst we break. Because we slightly overran, I would say let's take a little bit less than 10 minutes, but start again at 20 minutes past 1. And that should just give us enough time for the 2 remaining talks. So see you in 8 minutes. Thanks. All right, welcome back everyone after the break, and we're now going to continue with two slightly more specialized talks. The first one of which will be given by Dr. Lamis Hassan and is going to be focusing on social media data and natural language processing. The second one will be focusing on imaging and is given by Dr. Martin Fergie. And Q&A for the two talks together will be after Martin's talk, after the second talk. So Lamis, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Great. Okay. Thanks, Niels. So I'm a researcher in Centre for Health Informatics at the University of Manchester. I'm currently finishing up a skills development fellowship with Health Data Research UK. And my background's in psychology and health services research, but what this fellowship has done is given me the chance to dabble in computer science and learn how to use natural language processing or techniques, or sometimes known as text mining. So the broad aim of my talk today is to lightly introduce NLP and some of the methods and opportunities in an applied sense, drawing on some of the work I've been doing on e-cigarettes. So what is NLP? NLP is a set of computational techniques to understand and make sense of natural language, sometimes referred to as unstructured data. And many, but not all of these techniques that are used fall under the umbrella of artificial intelligence. But NLP is a broad field, and whether you realize it or not, you're probably going to be familiar with lots of different NLP applications in everyday life, such as predictive text and conversational voice recognition agents, such as Alexa and Siri. But today, we're focusing on health research applications. So just before I get too deeply into it, why should NLP be of interest to people who conduct health research like you and people who work with records? Because a lot of the most valuable data is found in the text. An estimated 70% of data in medical records is captured in text rather than being numerically coded information. And people use text, I think, because it's flexible. It captures complex concepts, like, for example, how patients are coping with different conditions and treatments. And it's easy to input and read, so it's a good medium for health professionals to communicate with one another. However, there are some drawbacks. It's messy. You can have spelling mistakes, for example, non-standard forms, different ways of saying the same things, same words used to mean different things, like HR in a records context could mean heart rate, or it could mean hour. And these subtleties make it difficult for researchers to analyze. So NLP is a way of making sense of text. And it uses symbolic or linguistic approaches and also statistical approaches to do that. Linguistic features can mean things like different word forms, or it can mean contextual information, such as the surrounding words in a sentence, different ways of representing words, and the grammatical structure of language. And of course, this is teamed with statistical approaches based on frequency of occurrence and the distribution patterns of different linguistic features. So typically in health research, what we're talking about is using NLP to retrieve and extract relevant information found in the text. And these techniques, they can use lexicons, so think of those as dictionaries or lists of words. It can include grammatical rules, and historically that's how most people did NLP. But increasingly, it's using AI. So machine learning algorithms and neural networks in particular influencing NLP. Or it can even use combinations of the two. And basically, once we have that information, once we've retrieved that information from text, we can use it for data mining purposes, including for prediction. So in the sense that Chris talked about, such as language patterns might be used to predict the risk of future outcomes, such as risk of suicidality or self-harm. And in a broader sense, we also talk about prediction in terms of predicting, for example, what category a document might belong to, what type of document it might be. So getting those classes right can also be another way that we talk about prediction in the context of NLP. So what kind of information can NLP be used to retrieve in health research? Well, it can be at a document level. So you might be training an algorithm to identify whether a document is a clinical document, is a letter or a test result, and doing that automatically. but some of the common features are actually recognizing key attributes within those documents that we call features or entities. So these might be, in a clinical sense, particular medications, diagnoses, or symptoms. And this is a rapidly evolving field, so often developing NLP methods can be the goal in itself in many papers. Or it might be part of more of a complex project or a pipeline to fulfill an overarching research goal. So you could use NLP, for example, as merely a method of case identification, so trying to find everyone with a particular diagnosis like depression. And indeed, Google Health, their head David Feinberg at the moment, has recently revealed Google's plans in this area involve this type of work. So he has said, imagine a search bar at the top of your electronic health record that needs no training. So you can see it might these tasks are of interest more widely. It's very much of a hot topic. I'm going to illustrate a bit more about those examples by sharing two papers that I think are useful. I encourage you to look at them if you're interested. So in this first study, researchers trained an algorithm to read breast pathology reports and identify patients with a particular form of cancer. So we call that named entity recognition. And excluding spelling mistakes, typographical errors, things like that, they identified 124 different ways of saying the term invasive ductal cancer. And on top of that, they found 21 different ways of ruling out a diagnosis. So saying this diagnosis is not present in some way, usually indicated by the words before or after the diagnosis. So if you do some quick maths and multiply 124 by 33, you can see very quickly you've got a potential over 4,000 different ways of saying that ductal carcinoma was not present. So hopefully when you realize that when we're talking about a search bar for electronic health records, we're actually talking about something quite complex. It's not a matter of control and F. It's not going to cut it. These are quite complicated methods because we're dealing with complex language. But what can you do with that? What can you do with entities like that once you've actually found them in a research sense? So our second example shows how NLP could be put to good use as part of a wider pipeline in health research. And here the researchers used mental health records this time, over 14,000 of them, to identify patients prescribed clozapine, which is seen as a last resort drug often used to treat psychosis. And what they found, as you can see in that graph there, is that patients that were given clozapine had better survival rates than those that were not. The reasons aren't fully clear, but the researchers concluded it wasn't because of fewer suicides, and it wasn't because those patients were receiving more care. Now, I could get into the details of this, but the most important thing to see here is that because prescribing was captured in the text, the researchers would not have been able to do that research without using NLP. So this is a strong example of how you can use NLP to add additional variables like prescribing, like diagnoses, to complement the more structured data that you get in a record and use that as part of broader modelling and analysis. So next I want to talk a little bit more about some of the work I've been doing using social media data. And I've been working with some colleagues over at IBM on that, as well as Goran Nenadic, who's a great person to get in touch with about text mining at University of Manchester, if that's your interest. So I've mainly talked about patient records, but there is a lot of interest in applying NLP to social media, often because it's available, it's plentiful, the idea it's giving signals in real time. This paper is really interesting if you are interested in some of these areas. And there are lots of areas of research emerging. The area I've particularly been drawn to at the moment is identifying reports of drug side effects in social media for pharmacovigilance purposes. So monitoring after drugs have gone on the market. And I'm looking at e-cigarette use here. And this is a good topic for me to look at because it's common. These products are evolving quickly, but we don't know what the long-term health impacts are. So data about side effects for e-cigarettes are probably unlikely to be found in a medical record. So we need to look elsewhere, and social media is a good place to attempt that. So I think. After I decided to look at this, shortly after there were a series of high-profile series of hospitalizations and even deaths, mainly in the States, that were linked to vaping. So you might have seen some of the headlines last summer about this, and they strongly linked the analysis that followed strongly linked that outbreak to vitamin E acetate, which is an additive in certain vaping products. At the time, THC containing vaping products, that's the active component in marijuana. So I set out with a couple of research questions, mainly to look at, well, what are these key topics online about e-cigarettes, how are they talked about on social media? Are there any geographical differences? And could this type of data be useful to look at adverse drug reaction reporting in terms of looking at the side effects of e-cigarettes? So a fairly standard data science pipeline that I'm going to run through with a couple of NLP twists, just to give you an idea of what a project might look at. As is standard in most data science pipelines, there's a lot to get through before you get to the fun stuff of analysis. So briefly, we used Tweepy, which is a library in Python to access Twitter API and download some data for tweets with terms related to vaping, e-cigarettes, and associated products. And then after we collected these tweets, you had to prepare them for NLP analysis. So I'm going to choose an example tweet here, and it's absolutely nothing to do with e-cigarettes, but my philosophy is that all presentations are made better by cat pictures. So we are going to go with a tweet by the account from Larry the Cat, which is number 10 Downing Street's resident log. So if we look at this, you can see some fairly standard tasks in NLP. First of all, tokenization, so splitting the text mainly into words, but it can also involve things like punctuation, other types of punctuation and markers too. Then what we do is we ask the program, the algorithm, to remove superfluous words known as stop words, which are very common, but sometimes not that meaningful for analysis. So and, to, the, for example. And then certain words are stemmed. It's called lemmatization. So you can see that word larger has turned to large, and that's so that we can group it with other word forms like large and largest. And then as well as single words, we're looking at combinations of 2 and 3 words. Then we move on to variable recoding creation. I'm not going to go through a lot of this, but when using social media data, it's useful to acknowledge that you might be dealing with automated accounts known as bots. So one way to do that is to use pre-existing algorithms like botometer, which assign scores, giving the likelihood that an account is automated, and using those in your models. We also derived user locations, and because the user can write anything they want, that involved a bit more again than keyword searching. So we used an existing library within Spacey, which is an NLP tool available for Python, very useful again, to identify locations and group those into the UK, the USA, and other, with a little bit of fine tuning. And from there, we can do some basic data profiling, so generating tweet counts, looking at common words, looking at overlapping words by location, and then finally get to the good stuff, where I'm going to spend a little bit more time now looking at. So in our case, we use 2 different methods which are of interest. One is topic modeling, and the other is this named entity recognition, and that's to look at adverse drug reaction detection. So firstly, to identify topics, we used LDA, which is an unsupervised machine learning method for discovering hidden topics in large volumes of text. And I'm not going to go through the details. I'm sure Chris could probably do that a lot better than I could. But basically, you specify the number of topics up front, and that can be anything from like 2 topics to 80 or more if you like. And LDA uses the processed text inputs that you give it to generate sets of words, associated words, which are meant to characterize underlying structures or topics. If you're a qualitative researcher, you can think of this as almost the quantitative version of content or thematic analysis. And there's various ways of evaluating these results. You can use statistical measures of topic coherence, but also it can be about how interpretable they are. So what we did is we tested various models, varying parameters. This model here at the moment with 5 topics is coming out in front. So you can see these are word sets that are associated with each topic. And these are salient words that are intended to form the topic. It doesn't name the topic, you have to do that yourself. You have to look at the tweets that are associated with each topic. But you can see that some of these are more interesting to us than others for health purposes. And what's really fun is you can visualize the topics too. I'm not going to go into it now, but in Python there are interactive models, libraries that you can use to explore these topics and look at how words are associated with each different topics. What you see here, these bubbles are basically represent topics, and the larger the bubble, the more prevalent those are. And once you've looked at those tweets, you can see that these topics are associated broadly with stance. So they seem to cluster on pro-vaping and anti-vaping topics. And then at the top, you seem to have a cluster of topics that are more associated with actually advertising and selling e-cigarettes online. So this can be quite useful in terms of quickly identifying what is the underlying structure of your document without any kind of annotation or supervision whatsoever. So very useful, I found. And from there, what we've done is we've used this off the shelf on this data set to examine the balance of topics in the UK and USA, look at differences, and if you really wanted to, you could use similar methods to almost predict incoming tweets and which topics they're most likely to be aligned with. So for example, you had an interest in a particular topic, you could use that model to look at all those tweets that meet a certain threshold and see how well your model does that. And the second part is identifying side effects or adverse drug reactions. So again, very briefly, I'm just going to explain the principle of this. The idea is that you are trying to identify the medication, the unintended effect, and extract relationships between them. And this kind of process, so there's an example here to do with steroids that I've borrowed, requires human input to do. You are basically annotating these. You are using a computer program to highlight some of these to train a model in a supervised way. And then that is used to train a machine learning algorithm using various ways of representing words, features, vectors in various different ways, as Chris mentioned, about in high dimensional ways, depending on what you want to do. And as you can imagine, this takes time and effort to train a good model. So in terms of e-cigarettes here, you can see there's an example here that we might be looking for. Plus, you've got to think that those side effects might be rare in your data set. So for example, I've been annotating some e-cigarette data, and it's taken me, of 1,000 tweets, I've found around 10 that contain side effects. So you might have to do a lot of work to create a usable model.
Hi, let me sorry to jump in. I'm conscious of time, so maybe you could.
I will wrap up quickly.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah. So one good thing about NLP is that people are very keen on sharing their resources. So we've been using KDEC, which is an existing corpus of annotations to train our models. And the kinds of outputs that you get from NLP, if you're an epidemiologist, you will have seen these kind of confusion matrices before, where you get true positives, true negatives, and you use the model to make a prediction. So in this case, does the tweet include an ADR or not? So this is what you're looking towards. And you use that to compute an F-score. So in summary, NLP methods, great at analysing large volumes of text, particularly useful for identifying named entities and using those in standalone ways or as part of more complex research. But we have to be cautious because text data is messy. There's still a lot of manual input, interpretation, annotation, fine-tuning that is involved, and I haven't even begun to touch on ethics. Maybe that's something that we pick up on if there are questions and if there are time. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Lamise, and sorry for having to rush you towards the end. Great talk, I must say, and I think people really enjoyed it. I saw some comments in the chat as well. We're going to move on immediately with Martin's talk, and hopefully we will have a couple of minutes towards the end for questions, both for yourself and Martin. So Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Niels. So good afternoon, everybody. My name's Martin Fergie, and I'm a lecturer in health data sciences in the Informatics, Imaging and Data Sciences group. And my main interest is looking at using AI and machine learning to analyze medical images. I have a particular interest in histopathology images, but I do work on other projects, and our group has a wide range of interests, and I'll talk more about that later on. So, So to talk about today, so what I was going to cover was first an introduction to AI and machine learning. Now, my slides looked very similar to Chris's slides, so I've chopped them down a bit. And I've also got some case studies to talk about of AI focused on medical imaging. So I've added an extra one here to account for that. And then I'm also going to give a brief overview of some of the challenges that you need to think about when designing studies, so particularly focused around medical imaging, and a little bit about our group and who to get in contact with if you're interested in engaging and maybe you've got some imaging problems of your own that you'd like to collaborate on. So first off, I'm going to start with a quick demonstration. And again, this is building on the concepts that Chris kind of consolidate some of the ideas that we've already discussed. So here's an example, very similar to what we had earlier. On the right-hand side, we've got an example data set that we might want to train a classifier. We've got two variables, an X running along the bottom and a Y running along the top, or an X1, X2. And we're looking to train a model that's able to separate those 2 points so we can make a classification decision. And what we have is a weighted combination of these two variables. So we learn 2 parameters. So on this particular tool, if you highlight over the weights, you can see what values they so that the overall decision surface, it allows us to then separate the 2 groups. So if we were to take a new example, we'd be able to calculate whether this should be labeled as an orange or blue point. And this is really, I mean, this is not exactly the same as in this current form, but it's very similar to a logistic regression model that you would use in classical statistics. And these weights tell you whether or not an increase in the value is associated with a particular class or not. So really with machine learning, what we're interested in doing is increasing the complexity of this model. And again, this is something Chris talked about earlier on, to allow us to represent more complex types of data. So our previous example could only really fit a straight line in order to separate out the 2 classes. So now we can load a new example data set where a straight line will no longer separate it. So just to illustrate this, if we now try repeating the training process, our model can't separate this data anymore. So instead we just get this uniform prediction that doesn't actually represent the real pattern. So what we can start to do is introduce what are called hidden layers in the context of a neural network. This is not the only approach that's possible. And then when we train our model, we see that slowly over time, we can now represent much more complex functions. And as the model trains, it's able to find a way of separating those 2 data sets. And it's the same principle. We've got a set of weights and parameters that are applied to each of these variables. And really what's happening is that the model, if we look at these hidden layers, it's actually learning a set of linear functions, so a set of straight lines, so this one doesn't do anything, that when combined to form the final model, are able to actually separate our 2 sets of points. And in doing this, we gain a lot of flexibility, as Chris mentioned, but we lose a lot of the simple interpretability that we might have had before of how a single variable that we get at the beginning relates to a single outcome. So I thought I'd share that in the hope that it might help kind of, sort of broaden everyone's understanding of what's going on in that case. So I'll just switch back to my talk. So firstly, just a bit of kind of categorization of machine learning methods. So there are 2 main kind of ways of thinking about machine learning problems. So one is supervised learning, where we've got some data that we've observed and we've got labeled outcomes. So these could be disease diagnoses, and our model is trying to predict on a new example where we don't have the labeled what the correct label outcome is. Or we've got unsupervised learning. So this is a scenario where we've got some observations about patients, but we have no actual, say, ground truth outcomes about them. But we're interested in what we can learn from that data. And so this is one of the key things we might be interested in doing, is grouping that data, so clustering. And that's actually what Lemise was just talking about with linear discriminant analysis. Sorry, latent Dirichlet allocation. It's the same kind of problem that you're looking to do there. We also might be interested in being able to calculate what the probability of observing a particular example is. This is called density estimation. And this can be used quite usefully when you're doing rare event detection. Now, within supervised learning, there's a couple of main problems that we're interested in solving. So one is regression, where we're trying to associate a continuous input, X, with a continuous output, Y. And so predicting risk of events, say a survival outcome, might be considered this. And the second is classification, where we're trying to associate an input X. In this case, we've got two input X's, two X variables drawn as a scatter plot. And we're trying to predict a discrete output label. So now I'm going to sort of switch on to deep learning for image analysis. So obviously, as we've seen already, deep learning is really what's been kind of accounted for some of the big kind of leaps in terms of the performance that we can achieve with these models, particularly when it comes to signal data, so images, audio, but also natural language. So a traditional image analysis pipeline would consist of, we'd have our input image that we're interested in classifying. So for example, this is actually a sample from a breast cancer tumor, and we might, from a breast cancer slide, and we might be interested in classifying whether or not this particular region contained cancerous cells. So we would extract some feature representation where this is something we would design based on the problem we're interested in. So it could be texture or color features. And then we'd apply a machine learning model at the end of that in order to classify it into our two groups. Now, what deep learning does is skips that middle section and learns the feature representation automatically. And it is able to adjust one that really suits the problem at hand. So, and here's an example of, what's really the key kind of deep learning model that's led to this kind of like real improvement in terms of performance. So the convolutional neural network is kind of structured as follows. So on the left, we've got the input image that we're interested in classifying. We then have a set of what are called feature layers. Now these are, they're called convolutional kernels, and they actually work in an equivalent way to the little knobs on your stereo that control the bass and the treble. So what they do is they identify and pick out certain frequency elements of the image that are useful in order to make the final classification. And so here are some example filters that have been rendered from a natural image problem. And I'll show you these in more detail in a minute. And at the final layer, we then have what's called the fully connected component. And this is really a classical neural network, like I've just showed you on the demonstrator, and very similar to, say, a logistic regression model. But the key point is now that the data in these blue squares here has a much richer representation that allows us to do accurate classification. So here's a quick illustration of the increasing complexity of the filters as you move down the layers of a network. So it starts off with very basic things, picking out dots or vertical lines or lines on different angles, and then moving towards very complex textures that get learned by the model. And if we were to take the data that's then represented in those little blue nodes at the very end of the network, and we can take a set of images, calculate what the values are for those blue nodes, we can use it to lay our data out into a 2D grid. And we see that similar images are grouped together in a way that makes training a classifier very easy. So it might be hard to see on your screen, but we've got, say, grassy fields and outdoor scenes, clocks, wheels, boats, and planes. And it really creates this very rich embedding, which is what allows us to train very accurate classifiers. So now I'm going to move on to cover a few case studies of applications in medical image analysis. They're more focused, I suppose, on clinical use cases for medical images. And for each one, I'm going to try and talk through what's happening from a machine learning perspective, just to try and help you understand what's happening from technically, what the clinical benefit is, each one aims to do, and then how the design of these models supports clinical interpretability. So the first one, and actually Chris showed an image from this as well. So this is a project by UCL, Moorfields Eye Hospital, and Google Health. And it's looking at automated diagnosis and referral of retinal disease. And this is working from optical coherence tomography, which is scans that are made in high street optometrists. And so the idea is that they are trying to ultimately go from a digital OCT scan, which is like a three-dimensional image formed of the retina, And the outcomes they're trying to predict is A, a referral. So does this patient have something in that OCT scan that needs to be referred to a specialist? And the model will predict that. But also a probability over all the possible diagnoses that image could exist. And what's interesting about this is they thought about clinical interpretability from the get-go. So the basic algorithm will take an OCT scan, and first it performs a segmentation to segment that OCT image into its constituent components of the retina itself and the different layers in the retina. I have very little clinical understanding of that, I'm afraid. And then finally it goes from this segmentation map and uses that to predict the actual outcomes. And so this means that a clinician, if they see a surprising result come from the algorithm or something like that, they are able to go and interpret and look at what the algorithm made as its intermediate step in terms of segmentation to try and understand that effect. And you can see some of the results from the segmentations here, where it's able to pick out various different artifacts that you would see in these images. And so to sort of summarize what this particular case study is doing, so from a machine learning perspective, it's using a technique called image segmentation. So here what we're really doing is applying a classification decision at every pixel in the image. So that's saying which layer of the retina, or is it a particular artifact? And we apply that classification to every pixel. But then they're also making an overall classification to say, from the segmentation map, is this an image that should get referred to a specialist? The interpretability is built in through explicit segmentation, so allowing the clinician to then validate that the model has done that segmentation correctly. Now, the clinical value is about giving expert level performance that's much more widely available. And this is a common factor you'll see in these sorts of AI applied to medical images. And these ROC curves capture that effect. So what we've got is the blue line gives the algorithm performance, with the blue star being a particular point at which the algorithm makes its decisions. And then you've got 4 retina specialists and 4 general optometrists. What you see is the algorithm performs in line with the retina specialists, but outperforms what the general optometrists would do if they were making the same interpretation. Okay, so the next case study is now looking at in the pathology area. And this is by Memorial Sloan Kettering, along with a company called Page AI. And so this company is very interested in being able to detect small cancerous regions in whole slide microscopy images. And so this particular example here is a prostate pathology example. And then needle core biopsies, where if a patient has a suspected prostate cancer, small needle core biopsies, potentially multiple needles would be taken, and from each needle, multiple sections will be cut, which can then be looked at under a microscope to detect small cancerous regions. And so to give you an idea of the scale of the problem, this is one single microscope slide. And as you zoom into increasing levels of detail, you can then see the sort of scale of a cancerous region potentially that a pathologist could be asking to find. And this is a very labor-intensive task for obvious reasons. So the approach used by these researchers is to take a very large data set of these microscopy slides, break each one into small tiles, and then train a classifier which is able to classify whether or not an individual tile is cancerous. Now, what's particularly clever about the way they've done this is they don't need pathologists to label the cancerous regions. They can use the slide level, was this patient's diagnosis a cancer or not, in order to train the model that can then predict at the tile level. And so the resulting effect is that they can then get a sort of probability map over the area of the slide, which can be fed into a final classification network to give an overall diagnosis for that patient. Now, in practice, you wouldn't really want to use such an automated diagnosis system, certainly immediately, because you don't quite know how well its errors are going to behave. And it's obviously a very, in terms of it's operating as a risk-managed medical device, is very challenging. So instead, what these researchers do is look at a hypothetical scenario where you use these prediction probabilities to reorder the slides. So what they will do is show the high risk slides first and the low risk slides later on, so that a pathologist is more likely to spot the cancerous slide first. And they show that 65 to 75% of the slides could be ignored by pathologists whilst maintaining 100% sensitivity. Go on, Niels, have you got?
Martin, yes. So just so we keep 5 minutes roughly for Q&A, I'm not sure how many slides you still have.
I'll tell you what, I've got another case study. I'll skip it and then I'll just do my little wrap up.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. So I'll just go a little bit over the key challenges then that you need to think about if you're engaging this kind of topic. So firstly, these always involve data annotation. And this is an expensive procedure because often experts have to manually label the images that are needed to train the algorithms. You also need to bear in mind that annotations can be subjective, with different experts giving different interpretations. Sometimes consensus may be required. When available, clinical outcomes are ideal, but this is often not always practical. You need to be very careful when it comes to generalization across centers. So as Chris mentioned earlier on, overfitting is a problem that needs to be thought about. And particularly if you're trying to train an algorithm with data from one hospital and then evaluate it in another, you need to make sure that you've actually got that diversity in your training set in the beginning to ensure that your models can generalize, but also that you do independent evaluations on different centers. And then finally, there's some things to think about from the end commercial perspective. So if you're interested in taking this out to clinical use, odds are it's going to have to sit in some kind of commercial framework. So you need to think, who's going to benefit from this technology and who will pay for it? And if those are different organizations and different budgets, adoption may well be more challenging. So finally, our research group at the university deals with a lot of wide range of medical images, and there's a lot of collective experience. And if you're interested in collaborating, you can contact Tim Coots. I promised I've asked his permission to do this, and he will redirect you onto the most appropriate person depending on your data. So that's it from me. If you're interested in learning more, there's a couple of good books linked here that are both freely online, freely available. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Martin. Really fascinating stuff, I must say. Let's progress immediately to the Q&A. If you have a question, either for Lamise or Martin, please enter that into the chat. I've seen a couple of questions for Lamise already. I'm not sure if we can answer them all, but I'd like to start with a question from Ahmed, who said, I was wondering, given your non-technical background, how much time did it take you to gain technical experience to enable you to complete your research in NLP?
Lots. I dabbled a bit in R and data, but I think for this task you need someone who's there. You need some support. So I had a lot of support from Goran and Aditch and the Health Techs Network. If you are a programmer, you'll find this easier, but part of my mission is to try and make this type of work more accessible to non-programmers, because I think they are really useful, and there's a lot can be gained from programmers and non-programmers working together and making models more useful, interpretable and valuable. So try it, don't give up, but it is a steep learning curve.
Thanks. I think that's important, particularly important for the audience today. I think amongst whom there are many people who do not have that technical background, but would be interested in starting to apply these techniques. So there's also a question from Kai Kai. So for evaluating the performance of an AI model, computer science uses different metrics, such as the DICE coefficient, the F1 score, accuracy, etc. But how do they translate into clinical interpretability? For instance, the ability to segment tumors or identifying cancer. Perhaps, Martin, that's one that you could pick up.
Yeah, so they're all kind of different metrics that you can use to assess segmentations. And I think you may find that depending on the particular application that you're applying your models to, different metrics give you sort of better differentiation in terms of the model performance. I think ultimately, if you're interested in how well a given segmentation model supports clinical interpretability, you may have to have an actual human reader study that sits as part of your work to suggest, given the given model or a set of models, which of those ones gives you the most useful information to that clinician. So I imagine that question is very application specific.
So I've got a second question for Louise, also from Kai actually. So did you need to train a language model first on your corpus before you could then train the classifiers?
Yes, sorry, I just added that in the text just in case we didn't get time to get to it. Yeah, we're using some pre-trained language models that can cut your time. Again, NLP researchers like to share resources. So we're trying that using something called bidirectional LSTM, which basically takes into account where the word appears, like left to right, right to left, and using that as an additional layer in the model. It's complicated. I don't fully understand it. I'm trying it. But yes, it does seem to be useful, and there are language models that are trained on biomedical data and corpuses, which can help particularly for our area, so very useful.
Right, thanks. It is 2 p.m, so I think we will need to stop here. So as was mentioned previously, all the resources, all the slides, recording of this event, as well as further web resources, so some of the links, for instance, that we have shared through the chat, they will all be made available on the training page of the BRC. So bear with us while we make that available over the next couple of days, and then you can have a look at that. Obviously, also feel free to reach out to either myself or Jane if you have any further questions. I would like to thank all our speakers today for what I think was a really great event and fantastic introduction and overview of AI methods in prediction. And I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for attending today. And I look forward to seeing you again in 12 months' time for the next training event.